What an excellent day for an exorcism. Hello and welcome to this Ghouls Magazine panel celebrating the 50th anniversary of one of the greatest horror films of all time, The Exorcist. Released in 1973, directed by William Friedkin and written by William Peter Blatty, The Exorcist would not only scare the bejesus out of audiences, but would also go on to mark a pivotal moment in horror cinematic history, becoming the blueprint for the possession genre and leaving a legacy that has lasted 5 decades and I'm sure will last many more. To help me discuss the greatest film ever made, in my opinion, I have a trio of demonic entities who I'm going to let introduce themselves. First up is Mal. Hi, Mal. How are you? Oh, Mal, you're muted. There we go. It's the demons, the demons.
Hi, good to see you again. So I'm Mal. I'm horror fan, movie fan. Can be found on social media writing about all sorts of movie stuff, and it can be found at most film festivals where possible. But yeah, just excited about this. Really, it's an amazing film, and I'm looking forward to see how it all turns out. It's gonna be amazing.
Great, thank you for joining us. And up next is Becci Sayce. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me this evening. As you've said already, my name's Becci. I'm a freelance entertainment and SEO journalist, and you can find me over at Metro UK, Digital Spy, Moving Pictures Film Club, Ghouls Magazine, as I'm here today. And I've also had bylines with the likes of Dread Central and Certified for Goths. And yeah,
Great.
Like Mal said, I'm very excited to see what everyone's got to say about the film 50 years on.
Thank you so much. And joining us as well is Tim Coleman. How are you, Tim?
I'm really well, mate. Yeah. So I am also a freelance entertainment journalist. I write for places like Total Film, Fangoria, Second Sight Films, and I run Moving Pictures Film Club podcast as well. And I am also, this is a bit of a theme, I'm very excited to be talking about this one because I flipping love The Exorcist. And so, yeah, here for it.
Great. My name is Ygraine, and I am a senior contributor here at Ghouls Magazine, as well as a senior contributor at Moving Pictures Film Club. I am also the podcast host of What a Scream, and I also harbour a highly unhealthy obsession with The Exorcist, as most people who know me know. So grab your crucifixes, hold on to your heads, and mind the puddles of pea green puke on the floor, and let's dive into it. So I'm going to begin with, I would like to know, what is your experience with William Friedkin's 1973 horror megalith that is The Exorcist, and what were your initial thoughts on your first watch? Becci?
So I first watched The Exorcist when I was around, I think 11 or 12, something like that. And then before watching it, like my nan, who loved film as well, she'd always said it was one of the scariest things she'd ever seen, absolutely terrified her. But she'd shown me other horror films beforehand, and they'd not had that effect on me. So when she was telling me, like, oh, people were passing out, people were screaming when they saw this film, I thought, it's not going to be that scary. I'm going to watch it and think, oh, yeah, this is okay. Thanks, Nan. But then I watched it, and I still remember now going to bed and having nightmares. I was terrified of The Exorcist. But since then, it's been one of those films that I've watched every single year, and it's still had that impact, like 20 years on. It's still as terrifying as the day I very first watched it. And every single time I watch it, still I'll notice new things about the film. It's just so detailed, and it's such a wonderful love letter to the original story by William Peter Blatty. Like, it couldn't, in my opinion, be a more perfect horror film.
And Tim, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I came of age at kind of the perfect time in a way for The Exorcist. So in the late 90s, which was great time to be a horror fan, not only because we had the slasher boom after Scream at that point, but also we had James Furman stepping down as the chairman for the BBFC. And so we had a bunch of films which Furman had kind of blocked or kind of restricted the release of on home entertainment. We're then getting new theatrical re-releases and then releases on VHS and DVD. And as part of that, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came to theaters, and also The Exorcist again. And this was a new cut of The Exorcist called The Version You've Never Seen, which was kind of championed by superfan / Exorcist obsessive Mark Kermode. And that's a version of the film which is more akin to Blatty's original thesis or ideas. So anyway, that came out in theatres in the late 90s or thereabouts. And so I was about 18 then and saw it 3 times in theatres, absolutely just fell in love with it. And always since that point found it quite a comforting film, which I know that fear and comfort go quite hand in hand often. But for me, it has been a film which, even on subsequent revisits, as Becci said, you kind of see new things in it. And I feel like it's not only scary and comforting, but it also has an incredible textual depth to it that just continues to speak to me at like different stages of my life as I've gone forward. And so it's gradually kind of risen up the ranks of my favorite films of all time. So I would say it's not quite my favorite film, Ygraine, I'm sorry, but it is my favorite horror film. So maybe I can still stay in the room.
Leave now. And Mal, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I was, I again watched it when I shouldn't have watched it. I think I was 11 or 12. So this is back when it wasn't on the cinema. It would have been 80 something. I think there's an 81 release that was out by Warner Brothers. And then that found its way on dodgy pirate copies because that's all you could watch it on, because it then got subsequently banned. So I think I would have been 11, 12 when I saw it. And it was one of the things that we talked about. You know, in school, there's Exorcist and how people are fainting, that sort of stuff. And even my parents were like, "Oh, it's a really bad film." I think Dad had seen it or heard about it. And there's lots of things where you hype it up in your head, and then somehow ended up at home. So Dad came and watched it, and I'm like, "Oh, hang on, I'll try this on." And then it blew me away for 2 reasons. A, because this horror element was so vivid, but also there's so much more than that to the film, which I didn't really get at the time, but subsequently I've watched it since, and then obviously in the 90s when it came on the big screen, watched it again. And each time, like everyone said so far, I've just learned new things about it, but it's grabbed me from day one. This is the first proper horror film I probably saw. We'll debate about Jaws. So then with that, I was like, this is it. I love horror films. And it just went from there, and possession horror is one of my favorite subgenres as well. And I think it's just stuck with me, and I think it has that effect, Exorcist, where once you've watched it, there's so much there that sticks with you, not from the obvious scenes, but so much more. And I've kind of grown up with the film since I was an 11-year-old kid to like whatever I'm, to now. So it's just an amazing film. And again, like everyone else on the panel, rewatched it a lot of times and just looked for new stuff.
I first saw The Exorcist when I was 16, and the boy I was seeing at the time showed it to me, and I laughed my ass off through it. Like, I thought it was the most hilarious thing ever. But then later on, when I was lying in bed, and it was so funny, there was like foxes having sex outside my window. And if anyone's ever heard foxes at it, they scream, and it freaked the hell out of me. And then I started thinking about The Exorcist, and I started thinking about, I grew up in really Catholic Ireland. So then I started thinking about that, and it just really got me. And then I obviously just developed this huge obsession to it. And like you, Mel, I've grown up with it. And I feel like no matter what stage of my life I'm at, I can go back and, find something in The Exorcist to relate to, whether it's my feelings about the Catholic Church, whether it's my feelings about motherhood as a mother or motherhood as a child. And so, yeah, that's why I have such a weird obsession with The Exorcist, I think. So when The Exorcist was released into cinemas on December the 26th, 1973, audiences reportedly reacted viscerally with faintings, vomiting, and it was actually banned in a few countries due to its graphic nature and demonic depictions. Do you think, 50 years on, The Exorcist is still able to elicit reactions from audiences, although with maybe not quite the same fervor? Tim?
Yeah.
Okay, right,
it's
great.
a short answer. Yeah. No, I do. I mean, there's a bunch of things that would have fed into those initial reactions in 73, and part of it might have been the general religious beliefs of society. I think in the 50 years since, we're a far more secular and multi-faith society, which maybe means that people will engage with it on a slightly different register. But I mean, locating the filmmaking style in the mid-70s, this is for my money part of like the American New Wave or the New Hollywood movement, which is this kind of incredible swath of American cinema, including films like Godfather, Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, French Connection, of course, from Friedkin himself. And a lot of those films are kind of characterized, and certainly I would say The Exorcist is characterized by a real kind of cinema verite style reality to it. I mean, like Friedkin had a background in documentary filmmaking, and so like that, some of that kind of comes across on screen, that it feels not like the histrionics of a like James Wan movie, which, you know, I'm not dissing those. I love James Wan movies, but they feel very much like a kind of quiet bang ghost train ride. The Exorcist is, for me, like it derives its power from how seriously it takes its subject matter, and that it takes a long time to build up before the exorcism actually takes place. You essentially get about an hour and 30, hour and 40 of a family drama of a very disturbed little girl and people exhausting all secular options before they finally resort to calling in the priests. And for me, that's where its power derives. It kind of asks the question, well, what if demonic possession was really real, like really real? And what would that look like? And for me, that's never not going to be a stimulating or powerful hook. And I think it pays dividends in terms of being impactful.
Mm-hmm. And Mal?
Yeah, kind of echo what Tim says. When it came out, a film that hadn't done what it had done at the time, so I think audiences didn't know what to expect, and I think a lot of audiences at the time, and even in that era, although there was marketing and hype, it's not like we get today. So you would have gone in kind of blind on a lot of it. So you're going in not expecting to see what you saw. So I think that impact can be replicated in some respects with some of the films that when we talk about now, like I said, going blind. And suddenly there's a scene or two that just hooks you and you're like, wow, like Speak No Evil is a great example of that film. If you've seen it, there's a scene towards the end of that, for example. Don't know why that first film came to my head. But those sort of films where you go in and go in blood, I think there are films that still can do that. And I think it can elicit the same sort of impact today. I know, for example, with kids over 18s clearly, were to watch this, although I didn't watch it when I was over 18, because they're desensitized to this genre. And what I mean by that is, so not desensitized, they're more desensitized to like slashers and that sort of stuff where you think, oh, okay, it's a slasher, fine. And they think, oh, it's not scary, it's not gory. But the horror element of this is so subtle but understated, but also very powerful, that it plays with your psyche. And then people watching the film are like, did I just see what I saw? And then, wow, I saw that. And then some of the obvious stuff isn't as scary as the non-obvious stuff. And I think this film still would play well now, but going in with the less of a, right, scare me, kind of try and scare me now, but going with like, okay, let's see what it's got to say. But I definitely see it can have that same impact. It's just how you approach the film, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. And Becky, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I myself watched it like 30 years after it was released and it terrified me. And I know people now with teenagers watching it who are still scared by it. I think down to the very bare bones of it, even 50 years on, there's still something so scary about the idea of the loss of control over your own body and the loss of your identity through something that you can't control. The idea of being in Regan's position, of not being able to control yourself or knowing who you are, it speaks to us on quite a raw, fundamental level, especially from seeing it from a women's perspective, the idea of losing that sort of womanhood and femininity. I mean, at the time, it was sort of speaking of the fears of the women's liberation movement, but now we're living in like a post-Roe versus Wade society where women are having their rights and identities ripped from them as we speak. And then when we see that in The Exorcist, through like an innocent little girl having her identity taken away from her and then calling in the Catholic Church to reinstate that, there's something so haunting about it. And then it's something as well that I mentioned when we did our Wicker Man panel, also celebrating its 50th anniversary. I think there's something that modern audiences still find very intriguing and frightening about the intersection of like religion and horror. Like in the Wicker Man, we see it through the idea of like stubborn religion and how our stubbornness towards our faith can lead to devastating consequences. Whereas in The Exorcist, we see it from the idea of you need to lend yourself to faith for salvation, which I think even now in a society where I think religion certainly is on the decline in a lot of people and a lot of societies, it's still something quite frightening to see that being played out so brazenly and so boldly in a film.
And And I guess that leads us nicely on to my next question, which is the original readings of The Exorcist were a basic story, good versus evil, God versus the devil. Do you think that reading has changed and we are able to discover new subtextual meaning behind the film owing to what we now know and question about, say, the history of the Catholic Church, child psychology, etc.? I'm going to come back to Becci with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like with a lot of films, as society changes, we always read them differently based on not only our own personal lives, but things going on in society around us. But I think it's definitely still a reading that is very prominent in the film. It's hard not to be, with like priests being heroes in the film. I do think it's very interesting with the revelations we know, obviously, with the Catholic Church since, the fan theories and the fan readings of it being an allegory for Regan's abuse. There's lots of parts in the narrative, like especially Regan's behavior, like the hypersexualization, the like using inanimate objects to penetrate herself, bedwetting. It's all classic signs of abuse. And I feel like maybe, I don't think it was an intentional thing, but it's interesting to me that we do have those things present in the film, and then there's what we know about the Catholic Church on top of it. I think it's an interesting layer on top of the classic good versus evil story.
And Mal?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Like Becci said, there's obviously the Catholic Church part, but also I think a lot of it is when you watch the film, there's Regan's character itself. You know, she's sort of hitting that puberty age and that loss of control when you're going through massive change in your life, suddenly to be taken over by this demonic possession. You're like, what's going on in my body? And you sort of look at it differently because the poor girl's going through one thing and then this, and then I read somewhere recently about about her Linda Blair in the film as well. Didn't really know what half the stuff kind of meant to adult audiences, like with the scene with the cross, for example, and even some of the words she was saying. I remember one of the books that Mark Commode read. He said that, you know, she said in the book that she was like, "Well, can I say these words? Because they're pretty rude." She's like, "Well, yeah, go ahead and say them," kind of thing. So that the reading of her character and her as an actor completely shifts when you look at it now in these eyes. And obviously, I know we're going to come into later on, but motherhood's a massive one in this one, right? And I think Becci touched on it earlier about that loss of control over your child and that sort of thing as well, where you just think, well, what's happening? So, like I said, sometimes in this film, there's so much more, including the horror, that you read into it, that you can take what you want from this film, even the Catholic Church and the loss of faith potentially and that sort of stuff, relationship with the father's, his mother, all that sort of stuff, you just take separately and then throw in the horror and think, wow, this is a multi-level film that works in so many different ways.
And Tim, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that those are all like really fascinating points. And just touching back on what Becci said about Roe versus Wade, that of course was a judgment from '73, the year that The Exorcist came out. And so I think with the rolling back of reproductive rights in the States in particular, you know, re-examining The Exorcist through that lens is a really fascinating point. I guess like any great art, like it will always yield itself to like multifaceted interpretations. That's what like great art avoids being didactic and prescriptive and requiring only one reading. Like it's like this kind of glittering jewel that you hold it up to the light and you see like new and interesting colors refracted through it depending on what lens you're using. I think my personal feeling is that there's always been this kind of beautiful ambiguity and subversion at the heart of The Exorcist, even if you take it at its central premise about faith triumphing over evil, because it's written by William Peter Blatty, who is of course a Catholic, writing his novel and then the screenplay as a treatise essentially for the existence of God. And it's made by William Friedkin as an agnostic Jew. And so what we have on screen, certainly with the director's cut, is a complex interaction of competing worldviews and competing personalities. Like those guys did not always get on, and like that tension is, I think, part of what makes the film so powerful and so fascinating, is that it is, among other things, about working out one's own belief. And you can take that to mean whatever you want, whether it's religious belief about the world, but working out what you believe in the face of tension, opposition, conflict. And I think that's part of like what I find so powerful about it. I mean, yes, maybe Blatty was trying to prove the existence of God. But I don't think it like you come out of that film going, wow, the Catholic Church is great. Even like spoilers for the end, guys. But the lead exorcist is in it for about 5 minutes and then dies, and so you don't come away going, wow, that's like a bulletproof plan for getting rid of the devil, is it? It's far more complex and adult and interesting than that. And I've always identified heavily with Jason Miller's character of Father Karras, who is a very complex, conflicted character who, yes, he's a man of faith, but he's also a man of science. He's not superstitious, and when he confronts the devil, it's not with a ritualistic rule book, it's with raw, unleashed grief, trauma, and authenticity. And yeah, so I think even if we say yes, it's just about faith, I think even that reading is quite complex.
For me, I find The Exorcist kind of is this big question of kind of intent versus interpretation. For me, like I said, growing up in Catholic Ireland, I'm very aware of the evils of the Catholic Church and how they would treat especially females who were vulnerable or, didn't fit quite well into society, and how they were treated by the church, the priests, everyone involved, by their own parents even. And I find there's something very uncomfortable about seeing a child go through a massive psychological change, whether it's because of puberty, whether it's because of, the breakup of her family and being basically abandoned by her father. And her mother, I know she goes through all the usual medical routes, but like then her mother calling on priests, and even the way the story is portrayed, it's not really about Regan. It's not really about her fight. It's about the priests, their faith, and that fight. And I find that really reductive of Regan as a victim. And looking back on it, I'm just like, this isn't a story about good versus evil. And if it is, I find it really ambiguous about who the good guys are. I know, the Williams have come out and been like, it's a good ending, it's a happy ending. I'm like, but is it? Because the devil caused this, like, a priest to commit the ultimate sin, which is to carry out suicide. And you can't kill demons by just throwing yourself out the window. So the demon's gone, I've caused all this trouble and now I'm off. And this poor girl is left with severe trauma, but everyone's like, bye, Regan, good luck. So I find it like really reductive to be like, this film's about good and evil. That's my 2 cents on it. So Becci, I'm going to direct this next question at you. What do you think The Exorcist has to say about motherhood, especially in relation to the role of Chris MacNeil in the story, as well as Father Karras's own relationship with his mother?
Yeah, not much good. I mean, I remember when I very first watched this when I was a child, and I was like, oh, this is a really, really lovely story about a child reconnecting with a mum at the end. I thought it was lovely. And then watching it since, having my own daughters, I feel like the portrayal of Chris is really, really unfair in The Exorcist. I mean, on the basis of it, she's a single mother. She's been abandoned by Regan's father. I mean, we don't really know what's happened in their breakup, but we never see him on screen. He never comes to visit his own daughter in hospital. We don't see him at all, bar a photo at the side of Regan's bed. So she's dealing with all of this on her own. And then at the end of the story, it's 2 father figures, 2 male priests that are like their salvation. And it feels like a comment to me on single motherhood of the fear of your child will be irreparably damaged if there's not a father figure in their life. And that feels very unfair to me. And then a lot of the other things that are present within the narrative, like there seems to be a lot of fear of your child turning out like you within the narrative as well, like we see near the start when Chris is speaking about Regan's father, getting really verbally like aggressive, really angry, as you would be like for your child. And then later when we see Regan possessed, she's very much exactly the same. And in her most horrific moments, they're drawing parallels to her own mother, someone who's just there trying to advocate for her. And then again, there's a lot, as Mal had said earlier, there's a lot of sort of conversation in the film around the fear of like the losing control of your child in that situation, like losing them to an outside force, which is absolutely terrifying as a parent. But then there's also some sort of, I think, murky discussion in the film about losing them to their own womanhood, to puberty. And it's like the fear of, again, your daughter hitting those milestones and the sexual experience that she has already experienced as a mother. And I feel like it's something, from my perspective, that should be celebrated, like a woman's sexuality, sexual freedom. That should be celebrated, but through The Exorcist, it's demonized, and Chris is seen to fear that rather than guide her own daughter through that. So I do think The Exorcist can be, as much as I love the film, its representation of motherhood, I think, is incredibly reductive. It sort of, to me, suggests that like fatherhood is the ultimate salvation, whether we see it through the priests or whether we see it through finding faith, like as in Father God.
I'm a mother as well, but I also come from quite a troubled family background, especially when it comes to the relationship with my mother. And so I recently, now that I'm kind of doing the work to come to terms with my childhood, I'm looking at Chris as a mother, and I'm seeing all the ways that she fails Reagan. You know, Reagan's very sick, so Chris decides to hold a party in her house. You know, if you've got a very badly sick child, you do not put on a party, you know. And just there's several moments where Reagan, you know, she's like, help me, mother, help me. And this is before she's like proper possessed. And she's like, help me, mother. And Chris doesn't go to her. She like turns around and beats the wall. And for me, that feels very performative. She's doing it for like the rest of the people in the room rather than going to her child. Like, I know she does at one point, she gets thrown across the room or whatever, but it feels like her child is crying out for help and for love. But Chris isn't quite reciprocating that. It's almost like it's very performative to me. And, you know, there's times where she's talking to other people. And like, I know this is a film about demonic possession. Like, let's not get it twisted. So of course she's going to act this way. But when I look at it from my point of view, you know, she calls Reagan it. I think she calls her an animal at one point. And I'm just like, when I was going through that really hard teenage phase of like breaking away from my parental unit, of trying to find out my own moral path, my own identity, that's the kind of language that was thrown at me, that I was an it and I was an animal. And it just feels like Chris is missing this kind of want to go help her daughter. And like I said, a lot of the times it feels quite performative to me. So I'm going to direct this to the lads, seeing as these are both fathers. Do you think the film's commentary on fatherhood, reflecting, as we said, on the absence of Reagan's own dad and the introduction of the father figures in both Father Damien Carras and Father Lancaster Merrin, do you think it's a strong commentary, a good commentary? What are your opinions on the representation of fatherhood, Mal?
So again, I don't think it does fatherhood any favors either. I think the way fatherhood is presented is equally dismissive, equally reductive in so many ways, because it's like I said, her father isn't there, but also Father Carras's relationship with his father is kind of explored a bit, and he's got issues with that as well. And I look at it, and I'm just gonna just backtrack slightly to the question previously as well, where you look at motherhood as well. And I think although I agree with what you're saying completely, what I picked up was when Chris was doing what she was doing, I felt, my take on it was that she was trying everything she knew she could do or could try to do, which is why a last resort was in her brain, you know, right, let's get a priest involved, because she's not really a religious person. But also, I saw it as she had to play both roles. She had to play the father and a mother role, and she didn't know what to do, where to do it. And she's like, well, if he was there, would he host a party potentially? Because she's in the entertainment industry, she needs people to speak to, or speak with, you know, PR, whatever you want to call it. So she probably looked at it in that way and didn't have the capacity to deal with a child going through puberty because she's doing it on her own. So the fatherhood part is, for me, is non-existent. And I think I look at it and think to myself, yes, the priests are there and they come and save the day toward the end. But again, they don't really save the day. Spoiler alert, he takes the devil in himself and jumps out. He doesn't actually perform what he says he's going to do. And the priests don't necessarily, you know, like I say, one of them dies within about 5 minutes. So again, they're not actually the heroes in some respects, but what happens is we look at motherhood and fatherhood equally and say, well, there's nothing there, because ultimately there's nothing that's going to protect you from that possessive force. Whether you're a mother or a father, you're out. You know, nothing you can do. No matter what she tried, all the brain scans and hospital appointments and everything else, there's nothing you can do. The devil's like, do what you want. The strongest person won't survive, won't save you. And I think that's why parenthood generally is described or shown the way it is, because it's just like, well, you know what, do what you want. The person that's supposed to defend you and help you throughout your life can do nothing in front of me. That's the way I take it anyway.
And Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Mal's comment there that the guys don't come off particularly great either. And I think for me, I would probably take the view that it's a kind of an ensemble of like kind of classic new Hollywood flawed protagonists, right? We don't really have any hero to hang your hat on. Like, yes, Chris is flawed, but you know, Karras is equally flawed in a different way, right? He is supposed to be, according to his job description, like, you know, a man of faith, right? He's supposed to be able to come in and help the situation. And we meet him very early on saying to his friend Father Dyer, like something to the effect of, I'm not fit for purpose. I need out. I think I've lost my faith, Tom. And he's a guy who essentially is right up until the last moment, maybe, you know, right until the last moment, failing in his fatherly duties in that sense. And similarly, like with Reagan's biological father, I think that the criticisms that we make about Chris are completely valid, but at least she's there, you know. And like the biological father isn't calling Reagan on her birthday, and like, so I guess I don't feel personally that the film is overly critical of fathers or mothers, and I don't think it really holds up either of them as being, you know, perfect. I don't think Chris comes off as like Mother of the Year, but equally I don't think Karras comes across as Priest of the Year either. And I think that's part that those imperfections is what makes them, for me, A, believable, and B, compelling. You know, like, we're all parents in this room, and honestly, like, if I had to write a book about like the amount of times that I've had to like face up to my shortcomings as a father and then try and do better and move forward, honestly, there'll be like shelves. This is behind me. This is the shelves of my my failed attempts of trying to learn from my mistakes, you know. And so I think when you see characters who are like that, they're flawed, but they're trying. And I think what's more human than that?
So much has been said about the production of The Exorcist and the late William Friedkin's penchant for keeping his actors in a constant state of discomfort and anxiety by doing things such as shooting a gun randomly. Do you think this was necessary to what we now know of as incredible performances by Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn? Mal?
Necessary, no. Because no one should have to experience that on set. However, knowing what I know and seeing the film, I can see why it was done, and not to say that, oh, it was back in those days, so it's fine. Kubrick did it a lot as well, but I think what he tried to do was elicit those real reactions, but not in the right way. I mean, even the spider walk thing, I think initially didn't make the cut because not only because of censors, he wasn't sure on it, because I remember hearing in the documentary that he didn't get the right reaction from Chris because she was dealing with someone else being in the house at the same time and everything else. So whenever they were cutting to her face, the reaction was wrong or not correct to elicit what she just saw. So therefore, that scene didn't work. And I think he was a perfectionist in that respect, to say, I want the right response, because the audiences would play off that response. So necessary, no. But I do feel that I can see why they were done. I just, in this day and age, obviously wouldn't fly at all, right? But certainly now, I certainly can see why it was done. I think that's what makes The Exorcist as good as it is, because maybe it's most of those scenes or most of those reactions are real reactions, and the reactions we would have. Or if you saw something, you know, you'd see them and think, wow, and they're more believable. And I think that's where, for me, it works. I don't agree with it, obviously. But I can see why they were done and the impact around having them done. And I think that's where Chris's character is so well acted, because her reactions, even however they are, in a constant state of fear, it's on edge, and we as audiences are on edge with her throughout the whole film. and I think that works really well for me.
And Becky?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. It's definitely not necessary. I don't feel like anyone should be treated like that on set. And it's impossible to know, I think, well, obviously now, whether it was necessary to the performances or not, because we'll never know what performances we would have got without people being scared of being shot in the face with a shotgun or William Friedkin punching them. I do agree with Mal, though. The reactions we see, there is something obviously so real about them because it was what they were feeling. And it's very similar with things like The Shining as well. You can really feel that fear and intensity in the performances. But yeah, I don't think it ever really justifies, the method behind the madness. It, the impact it can have on these cast members. But then everything I've heard from like Ellen Burstyn, Linda Blair, since then saying like, oh yeah, he was mad, but this is what it did for my career. It feels very much like they appreciate it now almost as well. Like, not to justify that that's right, but it's very interesting to me, that reaction afterwards, because if I was put through that, I don't think I could say a good word about the person that did that, but they seem very like reverent of their time on The Exorcist and everything it did for their career, with, I suppose, with good reason. I mean, look, we're sat here talking about it 50 years on and talking about these incredible performances.
And Tim?
I'm just waiting for the moment where you're going to start firing a gun in the air, Ygraine, to get like some reactions from us. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not okay, right? And like, it also, for my money, kind of shows like a lack of trust in actors to act. That you got to have a kind of a mutuality of trust with your performers, that they can pretend to be scared or pretend to be on edge, without like, discharging firearms on set. I mean, that said as well, like, I think it kind of speaks to that pursuit of truthfulness, which a lot of filmmakers aspire to. And I think, as we mentioned a moment ago, like Friedkin's documentary background, you see it like kind of seeping out in other areas of his filmography, like, with the famous car chase in The French Connection, which they achieved by just basically bribing the transport official and then just flipping tearing, through the streets, rolling the camera illegally, and it looks real because it is real, or like the bridge sequence in Sorcerer. This is a director who is, he was called Hurricane Billy for a reason. He was like a big personality and would pursue those big iconic moments. Doesn't make it okay, no, but it doesn't diminish the fact that they are iconic.
Yeah, I kind of feel like he was the type of director that if he could have actually have gotten poor Linda Blair possessed by a demon, he would have done it. And like, I bet on those nights, late nights on the set, he had that Ouija board out, was giving it a go.
Reckon?
Like, yeah, I bet anything. But at the same time, like, we've seen plenty of accidents on set of like guns going off and killing people. And so even though I'm like, amazing performances, we might not have had those performances, it's still like, it's so dangerous. And it's so, like you said to him, surely he should have trust in the strength of his actors. But yeah, it's such like this like double-edged sword. It's like, yeah, they're great performances, but at the same time, someone could have seriously been hurt. Right. Yeah. And, did this kind of add to this whole like cursed film, atmosphere that The Exorcist has as well? Maybe William Friedkin was possessed.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, you got to go back and watch that Netflix movie he made. Was it the Devil and Father Amorth?
Yeah. So apart from retrospectively, I guess, The Exorcist 3 from 1990, why do you think, and this breaks my poor little heart, but why do you think The Exorcist has never had a successful prequel or sequel, unlike other classic franchises such as like The Evil Dead or Halloween? Becky?
I definitely think The Exorcist is a victim of its own success. I mean, it is so iconic that I feel like even possession, even horror films, even films a lot do not live up to The Exorcist, let alone something that's carrying its name. It's very hard. I think the sequels and prequels we have had, I think where they differ from The Exorcist is that they're a lot sort of more morally grey. Like, there's not that sort of good versus evil, that stark juxtapositions between like the visceral possession and the very innocent, sweet Reagan. we don't have those sort of contradictions in the other films. And I feel like the shock factor really dies with that. But then I feel like the reason they've not been as successful is us as an audience as well. I feel like as fans of The Exorcist, we want it to stay close to the source material, but not too close. We don't want it to stray too far, but then we want something totally different. I feel like it is definitely a case of nothing is going to live up to the first time you saw The Exorcist, because it's not just a film, it's an experience. It's like a rite of passage as a film fan, the first time you watch The Exorcist and that reaction you have to it. And I feel like any film that follows, because you've seen The Exorcist, you're not going to have the same reaction. And that's the thrill that people are still chasing. I don't feel like it's out of the question that we could have a really great like installment in the Exorcist franchise, but I feel like we just haven't got the right person behind it and the right sort of subject matter to have that same impact. Because there's been other possession films, I think, that have been equally as shocking since, but they're not Exorcist films.
And Tim, this is something you and me have discussed quite a lot on the Moving Pictures podcast, but what is your take on this?
If I'm going to be just really controversial, I'll say it's not been replicated because The Exorcist is better than a lot of those other films. And like I don't say that to diminish Halloween or Evil Dead. I love Evil Dead 1, 2, the new one. I love many of the Halloween films, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, etc. Like they're all beautiful movies, but there's a depth and complexity in the ideas behind The Exorcist, which is not easily replicatable, I would say. I think it's about that unique combination of those two personalities, the two Bills, Friedkin and Blatty, that was a lightning in a bottle moment. It's a bit of a cliche to say it, but it did capture something which is not easily repeatable. Like if you want to make a Halloween movie, you can boil down the substance of it into like a one-line pitch. Like it's a psychopath in a white mask who returns home on Halloween night, and then you can expand it. And like I'm not saying they're not more complex than that, because like they do interesting things, but like with The Exorcist, you can, if you try and just make it just about the exorcism, as films like Exorcist Believer did, where you've got this huge like 20-minute set piece at the end of that movie, that's not what this movie is about. It's about the ideas and the characters. And for me, like, why have we not had many good Exorcist movies? Maybe it's because that's not been sufficiently engaged with. Like, I mean, I should say I've not seen all the sequels, but for the ones I have seen, Exorcist 3 is the one that comes the closest, and that's because it's made by Blatty. And so we've got that kind of that interest in the same thematic ideas. We've got a complex, morally ambiguous protagonist, which is Kinderman, played by George C. Scott in that movie. And that's what we need. You know, I think, if people want to make a good Exorcist movie, David Gordon Green, if you're listening to me, man, there's still time to turn this around, this trilogy. We need moral complexity, and you need to it's not about the set pieces, it's about the people.
And Mal, what do you think of this?
Yeah, kind of sort of building on what Becci and Tim have said. I think it's difficult to come close to The Exorcist because, I mean, most of the points we've talked about so far haven't actually been about the exorcism yet. Haven't been about the big set piece, right? Hasn't been about the green puke and that sort of stuff. It's been about everything else around that. And I think that's what most films lack when they try and replicate an exorcism movie. What was that? Autopsy of Jane Doe came close with some of it. And Exorcism of Emily Rose wasn't too bad either. But films tend to get caught up in the big centerpiece. Even Believer, right? The end, and I'm not going to talk about too much about the end piece, but what it was. That became the centerpiece of the film. But The Exorcist said, well, that's part of the film, and that's what's going to shock you. But there's a load of other stuff which is just going to play on your mind for the next 50 years. And we're going to leave that in this film. And I think that's where films can't match up to The Exorcist. And like Tim said, yes, Halloween and everything else can do franchises because you can always flip a slasher film. You can always make a new version. You can always reborn something, an idea, and say, here's another idea of it. But you can't play the same trick over and over again with The Exorcist. And I think finding a new way of doing it has always been hard because it's always been about, I'm possessed, I'm then going to wreak havoc over everyone. Whereas, like I said, the film is more than that. And I think the fact that we've talked about, like I said, so many other things, for me, what happens with The Exorcist is you walk away thinking, and I think a few people have said it's not even about the horror. You walk away from that film you've seen a film, you've seen a theatrical masterpiece. You haven't seen a horror film in its entirety. I think that's why it's so good and can't be replicated.
I definitely think that the audience play a large part. You know, when we say there's a new Exorcist film coming out, or you know, here's another Exorcist sequel or whatever, people go in thinking that it's going to be a William Friedkin, William Blatty replica. And I get that because, you know, like we've mentioned, William Friedkin had that documentary background. And when you're watching The Exorcist, it looks like a documentary. You feel like you are in that house with those people and they've got a camera crew following them. So you're fully immersed in that story and in those characters. Whereas I feel that hasn't been replicated in anything else. You know, a lot of them are too shiny and too Hollywood, and I think that's one of the problems as well. They're treating it as if it should be this big Hollywood franchise when really that's not what they were originally going with. And I just, you know, me and Tim have discussed it, that I almost wish they'd go back to using a documentary filmmaker just to see, just as a little experiment. Let's see, you know, whether it works this time around. So what would you like to see explored in a possible Exorcist prequel, sequel, requel situation? Do you think there's much scope for a universe expansion, Tim?
So, I mean, again, like you and I have spoken about this, Ygraine, that I will defend the first 40 minutes of Exorcist Believer as being quite interesting. Like, I thought that was interesting that they took it in a multi-faith dimension. I thought it was interesting that they made it a police procedural about missing girls, which I thought, you know, at that stage in that movie, I was like, okay, you know, this is in the spirit of Friedkin and Blatty, where you're going to just take it seriously as something which is perhaps a little bit everyday. And we should say in passing, actually, that was kind of the inspiration for the original novel. That in 1949, Blatty was 21 years old, and he read a report, I think it was in the Washington Post, of a alleged real possession case in Mount Rainier. And so he tried to get like the rights to write a non-fiction account of that possession, but the boy's parents didn't want to publicize it because they didn't want him to be known as the devil child for the rest of his life, which is fair, you know. So he writes like the fictionalized novel of The Exorcist years later. But anyway, so that kind of realistic documentarian, almost non-fiction version of those stories, I thought that was quite strong at the beginning of Exorcist Believer. And where that film came apart for me was when it got all silly at about minute 45 when the supernatural stuff starts happening, you know. And it's not that I think supernatural stuff is silly, but I just think tonally it kind of came off the rails. So what I would like to see is something of that ilk, and made by people who maybe are, and I don't want to be rude about David Gordon Green, but maybe made from a different strata of filmmaking caliber. So I would love, he's never going to do it, but I would love a Denis Villeneuve possession movie, you know, like something like Prisoners, but with a demon, right? That would be a flippant film, I would say.
And Becky?
So, sort of building on what Tim said about like the real possession sort of story, I'd like sort of read into like real possessions afterwards, and the children's accounts especially of what they've been through and how they see it now. And where I'd really like The Exorcist to go, or always wanted it to, was sort of like 10, 20 years down the line, Reagan coming out and speaking about it from her perspective of this didn't happen, this is my real story, and then a film based on the ambiguity of, oh, was she actually possessed or not? Because I've always found that very interesting, because like me personally, I don't believe in possessions, but there's still, even saying that now, there's still a part of me that thinks, oh, but is it, when you see like these videos and documentaries? So that's where I'd really like it to go. I would really, really like to see Damien Rugner's Exorcist movie after seeing things like Terrified and When Evil Lurks. I would love to see what he would do with the Exorcist franchise. I think he really understands possession films and understands how to make them scary for a contemporary audience. So I would love to see what he would do with the Exorcist.
And Mel?
Kind of sort of covered what I wanted to say, to be fair, in terms of sort of looking at Reagan's sort of future sort of self and what she would recount and that sort of thing. But I think the other thing I'd like to look at is maybe from a prequel point of view, just sort of this family setup. You know, what happened to the dad? Why did they go away? Why, what happened to Chris and their family setup? That'd be good to explore, just in terms of, setting that story from a thematic point of view. But also, I'd like to look into a bit more about sort of what happened with Dyer and Kinderman afterwards. Did Dyer and his fellow priest go on like the Pope's Exorcist type movie thing where they're going around the world?
Keep him out of this. Keep Russell Crowe and his Super Mario Brothers accent out of this.
I had to throw it in there. It was a farcical film, but it was what it was. But yeah, but see what he does in terms of how he's dealt with the loss of his friend, but also moving on from this massive thing that came out of nowhere. So I think there's nuances that can pick up from that film. And there's something that I'd like to look at more about the initial opening scene in Iraq and a lot around that. That would be great to explore. I mean, that's one of my favorite scenes in the whole film. It's just that sunset and what you see. That would be good to explore and just sort of see where more the mythology, more the sort of thinking around that area will be great to see as well.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mel. I'm really big into demonology, and I feel that's something that the new thing missed. It didn't quite hit it with the whole, lore behind the demon. I know David Gordon Green has come out and been like, this is the demon, but he never mentioned that in the film. And I would just like an Exorcist film that featured heavily on demonology, or hear me out, The Exorcist in space. Let's do it.
What? Sold. We are like one whisper away from Pazuzu versus Freddy versus Jason at this stage, though, right?
I mean
I'd watch that.
I'd put money into that. I'd be like,
Pazuzu possesses Jason, and then the thing writes itself.
Oh my god, quick to the writing room. So what do you think has been The Exorcist's greatest influence in the world of horror cinema? And do you think it will continue having an influence in the genre of horror as well as wider cinema for another 50 years into the future? We'll start with Mal.
I think Exorcist will always have an influence and always have an impact when it comes to that spooky horror story, because it plays on that demonology stuff that we don't really understand. Some people believe, some people don't believe. And I think it's done it so well that that's going to be the benchmark. Say, if you want to get spooked out by a position film, here you go. But I also think, sorry, what's the second part of your question?
Do you think it will continue having a massive influence 50 years down the line?
Yeah, and I think the reason why it will have that continued influence is because what you're going to look at is the future directors and future filmmakers will look at and want to cherry pick the good parts of that film, and then they'll fall over because they can't do it as well. But it'll always influence thinking. I think The Exorcist, what it does well, and has always done well, is create conversation, and everyone's got a different take on different things in that film. And I think that's what it does well. Because some horror films are just like, right, here's a horror film, or here's a position film. It's kind of paint by numbers. But there's so many, like we've discussed already, there's so many things in this film that you look at and think of, what's your take on that? And what's your take on that? And you don't get that from many films these days, especially horror films where, it's got to be an out-and-out horror, or it's got to be a drama thriller. But this is a bit of everything. And I think X does that so well. And one other thing, I think the score is phenomenal. And I think getting that right for this type of film is always going to be the benchmark. Tubular Bells, yes, but generally the score, even the prayer call at the start of the film, that sets everything up. And there's so much in that film where, again, the score makes so much impact. You'd go back to that sort of thing, well, at what point did it use this sound and what was that sound? I think, again, you go back to and reference The Exorcist for that as well, because there's so much more. So it's going to continue to be, there'll be more books written on this and more studies done on this, because there's so much in this film that you can take away and run with.
And Becky?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be scope for 50, 100 years down the line. People are still going to be speaking about this film. And for me, that is the greatest influence The Exorcist has had. I mean, we know that it's inspired many TV shows, films, music, games. We know that. But for me, I think one of the most remarkable things that it's done is continue to inspire more and more horror fans to embrace the genre. I mean, there's people that saw it at the time, that showed it to their kids, that showed it to their grandkids, that showed it to their great-grandkids, and it's still going forward now. I mean, I can't wait to show it to my children and say, you need to watch this film. This terrified me when my nan spoke to me about it. And I hope that they go on and do the same and tell their friends, and it continues to be passed down through that word of mouth. Because I feel like we don't get that as much anymore, like with social media and the age of streaming, like seeing films as and then and not enjoying the buzz around it. But I feel like this buzz has continued down since the 70s of people still say, look, oh, it's so scary. People were sick, people threw up, someone sued the cinemas. Like, people still know about that legacy. And I think that's remarkable, considering we can forget about a film in an hour after seeing it now, because they don't have that same sort of cultural impact.
Yeah, I'm with you, Becky. I cannot wait to show my son The Exorcist. He's 6 at the moment, so I'm definitely going to hold off a bit, I think. Maybe. No.
7.
Yeah, maybe 7, 7.5. I don't know. Tim, what about yourself?
I'm just waiting for his next birthday party, and like all the parents like picking up their kids crying, like yeah. No, I mean, will we be speaking about The Exorcist in 50 years? Yes. I mean, we've just gone past the 101st anniversary of Nosferatu, the F.W. Murnau movie. We're going to be having that same conversation in 50 years for The Exorcist for sure. It is one of the great, if not the greatest horror film ever made. And yeah, I mean, what Becky's saying about the cultural footprint, it is a film which maintains its reputation. I've got friends and family members who will not watch it because they have heard the stories, and there's a sense of danger about that film as well, like as if you may open yourself up to something which is potentially evil. I don't think that, by the way, but like I also think it has that kind of sense of risk and weight. But like, as I've kind of already said, I think for me, the thing that is the reason it is such a classic isn't just the buzz, the hysteria, the fear that its reputation, creates that precedes it. It's the quality of the filmmaking. And I think if there's one thing I'd like to see in its legacy, it's not just that we're still in 100 years talking about how nuns used to sprinkle people with holy water as they queued around the block to go see the movie. I think we should be talking about how did Blatty and Friedkin create a masterpiece that tackles some of the biggest questions you can ask yourself about the meaning of life, good and evil, survival, guilt, trauma, redemption, forgiveness. And they made it in such a compelling way that was so characterful. And regardless of any genre, it is a clandestine masterpiece that deserves to be inaugurated in the halls of cinema for as long as cinema is a thing. It's absolutely untouchable.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, it basically made the blueprint for what we now know as the possession genre. And especially, I think, when we look at, the possessed as a character. And if you think about possession, it's always going to be, a girl in a white dress acting a bit mad. Like it's set that blueprint, and that is what possession genre kind of is. That's what even people that aren't big horror fans, that's what they know. I think it's going to last. I think as long as there are people like us doing that, passing it down from generation to generation, hopefully I'll still be around for the 100th year. I think I'll be in my 80s at that point, so I hope I will still be wearing my Exorcist t-shirts as an octogenarian and talking to my great grandkids being like, hey, have you seen the film The Exorcist? And that's definitely going to happen. And I know that's true for a lot of fans as well. So I think the legacy it's going to have all those years down the line is the fan base. I think that is just one of the key reasons why it is going to have such a lasting influence in the horror genre. So that kind of brings it to the end. If anyone has any questions, please put them up in the audience. And while we do that, I'm going to ask you some really weird off the cuff questions because it's me, and what else would you expect? Do you think you'd be susceptible to a bit of demonic possession, Becky?
Yeah, definitely. My mind is not a strong fortress. There could be demons in there now. I'm just too tired from raising 2 demons to even be aware. So 100% yes. And Mal?
100%, yeah. I wouldn't even put up a fight. Like, go for it. Do what you got to do.
Wow.
Tim?
So, I mean, this is like only tangentially a possession reference, but the Marvel movie Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, that was of course made by Sam Raimi, director of Evil Dead. So that's my legitimate legitimate reference, but there's a line in that which I have loved since the first time I saw that film, where Benedict Wong's character Wong goes, "Fortify your mind," when the Scarlet Witch is coming for them. And I don't know, would I be susceptible? I would hope not. I'm going to follow Wong's advice and fortify my mind and keep the mental, fortifications in place.
I feel like a demon would try possess me, and it would get in my body, and it would go, "Why do you ache so much? What is wrong with your stomach? Oh my God, get me out of here."
And just leave you alone.
Yeah, it'd just be like, you know what? No, this is too
No.
much.
I may be from the third circle of hell, but this is too bad.
Why did you eat that last bit of cheese? Our stomach hurts so much. So yeah, that I think a demon would just give up on me. If you were a demon, what would you be a demon of? So for me, I would be like the demon of eye rolls, pizza rolls, and not conforming to gender roles. And my demonic name would be like, ugh. What about yours, Mal? You're on mute.
Done it again, didn't I? There's kids making noise upstairs. I'm careful they don't come back in the background. Or they're kids. They could be demons. But, who knows? Yeah, the demon of losing my shit, because I tend to do that a lot lately. I'm getting good at it, to be fair. So I'll embrace that demon in me, definitely.
Okay, and Tim?
So I would be the demon of malfunctioning technology, because like the number of times I'm on a Zoom meeting and the camera doesn't work, or I could say that was me, right? Just like muting Mal's microphone, like, with my evil powers. So I'll be that guy.
And Becci?
I think I'd probably be the demon of autocorrect and typos. Anyone who's in a group chat with me will see there's about 6 to 8 messages of me correcting something I've spelt crazily with numbers in it normally instead of letters. And I've given up now. People have just got to work out what I'm saying. I write in the day, on the evening when I'm chatting to people. I'm not correcting myself. I'm not subbing my texts. People have to work out for themselves what it means. So that would be me. Every time your phone goes crazy, puts ducking, that's me.
People just think you're speaking in tongues, but it's really just like, manic typing.
It's me just smashing the screen, just like, oh, I'm tired. Just work it out for yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question that's mainly directed at me from Dr. Gain. He says, you describe the death of Karas as sinful suicide, but is it not sacrifice in the most saintly or Christ-like way possible? No, I don't think. He invites the demon into him because he's getting pissed off, not really because he wants to say, he gets to the point where he's so rageful that he's like, come into me, I'm going to fight you. And then the demon causes him to kind of like throw himself, like in the Catholic Church, that is the ultimate sin, whether you're doing it to sacrifice, it was illegal here in Ireland up until quite recently because it was such a sin in the Catholic Church. So I don't see it that way. I know it's a real ambiguous thing where people are like, he sacrificed himself, it's a good ending. To me personally, it's not, because of how I know the Catholic Church is, and I just don't see it as a Christ-like sacrifice because of the way he hits a child. He basically goads the demon to come into him. Do any of you guys have any opinion on that?
So this is my view. I will say this is, and I think that this is the view that Blatty went for. I know that it is ambiguous in the film. Blatty famously had dinner with a friend after seeing the theatrical version, and the friend said to him, well, the devil wins at the end, and Blatty was mortified because he meant it like this. And of course, in Christianity, Jesus dies on the cross, but he does so to defeat hell and essentially takes the burden of hell into himself, onto his body, and then by his death defeats it. And so you could read, Karas is up in this elevated space with the devil, invites the devil into his body, descends down hell / down the steps, and then by his death liberates Regan. And she does remain free at the end of that film. Still, like, Pazuzu does not go straight back into her after the death of Karas. So yeah, I mean, this is my view, but I guess again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it's fascinating to me that two people who love this film very, very much can have very different readings of the ending. And yeah.
But isn't that also why the ending, we got the alternate ending, right? Because initially it's just he gives the medallion back, and it's like, okay, well, the devil's won, and you know, I just got on my life. I lost my friend, came over, but then with the other ending, he meets the detective, and they walk off, and the medallion stays with Chris. She's found a new faith potentially as well. So maybe there is something in that to say, well, that's why he went and done the different ending, to sort of say, well, no, the devil didn't win, you know, kind of thing, right? But I kind of lean on both, actually, because I can see your point, Ygraine, about how it is sinful to do that. But then I also see the reason that I think he had no other choice left but to absorb the demon and then jump out thinking, well, I'll save Regan this way. And it may have backfired, you know, in his brain, he doesn't know, he's thinking, wait, but I think that's all he had left, because it wasn't going well up until that point, right?
Okay, another question. How much of an influence do you think The Exorcist has been on so-called elevated horror? And after that, do you see The Exorcist as a metaphorical movie in any sense, possession as puberty, etc.? Who wants to answer that one?
Becci, I feel this has got your name on it.
I mean, I can definitely see stylistically it in a lot of like sort of elevated horror films, especially things like Hereditary, that sort of darkness. But I feel like William Friedkin, to say that to him, would just say, like, oh, fuck off. Like, he doesn't seem like the sort of person that would be, like, this is an elevated film. It's very much like a on the ground, raw horror film, is always how it's come across to me. The second part, do I see it as like metaphorical movie in any sense? Possession is puberty, absolutely, definitely. Like, based on the conversation Chris and Regan have at the very start when she's talking about Burke, it very much feels like she's trying to infantilize her child by saying, like, oh no, we're just friends, you know, nothing's going on behind the scenes. When Regan's alluding to the fact that she knows about sex, she knows about sexuality, and it feels like the film is about Chris trying to keep her in that box, trying to keep her from experiencing like the hormonal whirlwind that is puberty. So I think The Exorcist very much is like very, very much talks about possession as puberty. But as we've all said, there's lots of different readings for the film.
Okay, let's end it there. I'm sure we could go on for another hour, but unfortunately, I don't think anyone would stick around that much to hear me go on about it. So thank you so much to my hellishly fantastic guests. Where can people find you on social media? And do you have anything coming up you'd like to tell us about, Mal? You're muted.
It's me again. I'm kind of like...
I'm really bad. I'm sorry. I'm just conscious, like, my kids are going nuts upstairs right now. I need to go and see what once I finish off here. Yeah, I'm Mal Jutley on socials everywhere. I get involved in random stuff here and there. Unlike yourselves, I'm not, you know, I'm got a sideline of other daytime film stuff. Sadly, I just have a boring day job. So yeah, you'll find me on socials writing about films that I've seen or interacting with yourselves. But yeah, that's about it, really.
And Tim?
So I am still, for the minute, on Twitter/X at Fats Coleman, or you can follow Moving Pictures at Moving Pix Club. And Moving Pictures has a monthly podcast and bi-monthly Patreon episodes out. Our episode for December is going to be the lockdown 5-star no notes banger Black Christmas, and so the episode's coming out next week, so check that out.
And Becci?
Yeah, you can find me over on Twitter and on Blue Sky as well at BL Sayce Writes. And then you can find all my writing over at Metro UK, Digital Spy, right here at Ghouls Magazine, and over on Moving Pictures Film Club's website as well.
And you can find me on Twitter/X at @what_scream and Instagram on @whatascream. And you can find my writings at Ghouls Magazine and Moving Pictures Film Club, as well as being on the podcast over there. And you can find my podcast on wherever you listen to your podcasts. So thank you everyone for watching this vulgar display of power, whether live or on playback. There is so much more amazing content over on ghoulsmagazine.com, where you will find editorials, reviews, and the Ghouls Gang podcast. You can also sign up to gain access to exclusive content, where not only are you getting amazing extra horror fabulousness, but you will also be supporting us to continue creating such frightfully fabulous content. So again, thank you so much for being here with us this evening, and don't forget this festive season to exercise regularly. Thank you and goodbye.